Hey guys, welcome back. TJ here with Dead History and our next presidential series installment. This is part 2, taking a look at Andrew Johnson, the 17th President of the United States. I am solo today for the audio, the last part of this audio here. So I'm going to jump right in. Part 2, we're pretty much going to be looking at the presidency and then, of course, the death and the gravesite of the 17th President of the United States, Andrew Johnson. So on March 4th of 1865, Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural, it was a very rainy, nasty, muddy day in Washington, D.C. Not a nice day, but crowds showed up in drones. I mean, there was tons of them. Tons of people came out to see the second inauguration of Abraham Lincoln. And Andrew Johnson would be sworn in as vice president first in front of Congress. Andrew Johnson's speech that day would make an impression that would uncannily reflect his unexpected presidency just 6 weeks later. The story goes that Andrew Johnson drank several glasses of whiskey before he went to be inaugurated. He was definitely intoxicated, not feeling any pain, so to speak. So he gives a speech in which he is slurring his words and losing his way. It was completely humiliating. I mean, it was just an embarrassment. Not a very good showing. You know, he began to give this drunken harangue about how he was a plebeian and a man of the common people, and he began to refer to members of the cabinet there, and he couldn't even really remember their names, and he even had to be pulled down by his coattails by another member of the cabinet. I mean, this is not promising material. It was just an embarrassment. It was not good, not a good look. Very, very bad. So Andrew Johnson was suddenly the president after Abraham Lincoln obviously was assassinated. Andrew Johnson being his vice president, he became president. Andrew Johnson became the first vice president to ever take over when a sitting president was assassinated. So, first for the country. As I had touched on in my Lincoln video, Johnson was picked basically he was given the vice presidential nomination. He was picked by the party. You know, Lincoln had Hannibal Hamlin during his first term as vice president. Lincoln sent Hannibal Hamlin packing. He sent him home. And then the party picked Andrew Johnson. It was obviously a strategic move. Johnson wasn't a Republican. He was a Democrat. He was from Tennessee. So there was a lot of strategy, and they were trying this whole unity, you know, this party of the union type approach. So now Lincoln gets assassinated. Andrew Johnson's now suddenly the president. And he's suddenly the president of a country that's divided by war and a government that's divided by party. Johnson was essentially at the head of a Republican administration, but he wasn't a Republican. He was a Democrat, as I just touched on. So it was very, very odd. It was a strange circumstance. You know, as we touched on in part 1, Andrew Johnson was a self-educated man for the most part. You know, he never had any real formal education growing up at all. He came from nothing. So here's this man now who gave a drunken speech when he was sworn in as vice president about 6 weeks earlier. Now he's president. And he's president during a Republican administration, and he's a Democrat. So here you have a president who was elected by one party, he belongs to another, and then with a Congress that's very much in the opposite party from himself. He's going to have problems. He's going to have deep problems. That's really what it boils down to. Andrew Johnson was no stranger to struggle, though. You know, the dirt poor boy from Tennessee, he taught himself to read and write. He'd worked his way up from being an indentured servant to a backwoods tailor to U.S. Senator to now he's all of a sudden the 17th President of the United States of America. And due to his humble origins, Johnson developed just an uncompromising type attitude. And unfortunately, it proved to be ill-suited for the highest office in the country, the office of presidency. What can be said about Johnson? What can really be? The truth of the matter is, Andrew Johnson had no tact. He was a frontier brawler. This is what had got him to where he was. And, Johnson, just like anybody, a lot of people in power and such, they just go with what got them there. You hear that adage in sports a lot. Just go with what got you there. You're in the big game. You're in the championship. Stick with what got you there. Well, that was Johnson's mentality. Here I am. I'm a guy that doesn't compromise. I don't negotiate. I have my own ways and views, and that's it. And that's what he was going to go with. And the truth is that following Abraham Lincoln, and, following Lincoln would have been a virtually impossible act for any president. Let's face facts. Lincoln was just outsized in terms of his emotions, his kindness, his affability, his good nature, and his political savvy, which was very, very, very great. So Andrew Johnson did have a problem. I mean, he had a problem. Let's face facts. Who's going to be able to succeed Lincoln? Who's going to be able to do that well? Probably not many people, if anybody. But unfortunately, Johnson was just a disaster waiting to happen. And, the nation at the time, we were desperate for a strong leader. We needed somebody who could bring back the United to the United States, so to speak. It was going to be an almost near impossible task. You got to remember, 15% of the nation had taken up arms against each other, and more than 600,000 soldiers had already died due to the Civil War. It was a war that had left the Southern economy in ruins, and more than half of its towns were occupied by Union troops in the South. So, here we go now, right? Lincoln's dead. Johnson's president. We don't know what Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction really was going to be. He never shared that with Johnson. He really never shared it with his cabinet members. We have ideas. We have what we think Lincoln might have done, but nobody knows for sure. It's the great debate. So now you have a president who's thrown into this, and he really, in a tiny bit of a way, you can make the case, well, Johnson had no idea where the party even wanted to go for Reconstruction. And really what happened was Andrew Johnson wanted to bring the Southern states back into full-fledged membership of the Union as rapidly as possible. He did not want them to pay any particular price. So basically, Johnson was on a different track from Congress. So this thing between him and Congress, it was rife for battle, and there definitely was battle. Johnson grabbed the reins of power quickly, and he set his plans in motion while Congress was not even in session. He started, Johnson was in control of what the first months of Reconstruction were going to be like. That's really the bottom line. Congress was in recess. Johnson was in control of what Reconstruction was going to basically start out as. And what he does is he says that when the former Confederates ask for pardons and they're pardoned by him, then they can come back into the Union. Andrew Johnson was prepared to leave a lot of autonomy to the Southern states. He believed that they should pretty much reconstruct themselves. That's what he thought. The South, you guys did this, you seceded, you started this big war, now it's you figure it out. You reconstruct. So Johnson issued orders for the seceded states to hold elections and announced two simple conditions for the Southern states to be readmitted to the Union and to Congress. The two conditions were: the Southern states must agree that secession had been illegal, null and void, and they must essentially accept the 13th Amendment. They must agree that slavery was over, and it was over for good. Those were the conditions that were set. But the North had wanted something more than that. The radical Republicans in Congress wanted to really stick it to the South. And they did believe, as a matter of political philosophy, that African Americans in the South should achieve something much closer to equal rights than they had had. So now you have Congress who really wants to kind of punish the South, and you have Johnson, the president, who basically is just like, I just want them back in the Union. I don't want to punish them, and let's just sweep it under the rug and move on. Well, the 13th Amendment was passed, as we know, and it freed up it basically was freeing about 4 million slaves when the 13th Amendment passed. So what did the southern state legislators do in open defiance in response to the 13th Amendment? They enacted what were called the Black Codes. The Black Codes were basically, so a black person out there without a job, they could be put immediately to any kind of labor you want. Any black kid could be taken away from his family and they could be apprenticed. And then they could be sold for up to a year of their labor. What does that sound like? Does that sound like slavery to you guys? Does that sound like exactly what slavery is? Because it sure as heck does to me. So the Republican-dominated Congress was furious over these black codes, seeing these state laws as a ploy basically to keep the old slavery system in effect. That's the way Congress felt. So now a full-scale political war erupted between Andrew Johnson and Congress. Congress thought President Johnson was letting the South off way too easy. Way too easy. And Johnson basically says that this is basically a continuation of war powers and that he can do what he wants to do. And Congress says, no, you can't. So there was no longer a war. Civil War was over. So Congress did not need to defer to Johnson. They didn't need to do so. So basically, it was no longer an emergency situation. And so Congress did everything they could to actually take back power and make Congress the center of policymaking. That's what they were going to do. But here we go, rolling along. Now Andrew Johnson vetoes the Civil Rights Act. And there is this sudden realization now that this man, Andrew Johnson, he cannot be trusted. They viewed, meaning Congress, they viewed Johnson as going beyond Lincoln's policies. And for only the 8th time in the country's 90-year history, Congress overrode the president's veto and the Civil Rights Bill passed. Okay? This was just the beginning of Andrew Johnson's veto-happy power, so to speak. Because over the next 3 years after that, Andrew Johnson issued 21 vetoes. That is more than George Washington, James Madison, Andrew Jackson, and Abraham Lincoln combined. Yeah, combined. But Congress overrode 71% of the vetoes. That's the highest amount of vetoes overridden for any president ever. Crazy. Again, what can we say about Johnson? Andrew Johnson did not like to negotiate. He did not like to consult. He just wanted to act. He just wanted to do what he wanted to do. He did not want checks and balances. He did not want to be told, maybe we should do this. Or, hey, why don't we give them this and then they can give us that? There was none of that. He was not about it. And so really, Andrew Johnson was just not an effective president, and the Republicans in Congress got their way a lot. A lot. So now we're steamrolling along. We're steamrolling along through this Johnson administration. And the battle next moved into the 1866 congressional elections. Johnson set a precedent, becoming the first president to actually actively campaign against the opposing political party. What did he do? He went on a whistle-stop tour that he called the Swing Around the Circle. Johnson went from Washington up to New York, and then across the Midwest all the way to Chicago. And what was he doing? He was advocating his policy for Reconstruction, and he was attacking radical Republicans at every train stop. And literally, it proved to be a disaster, and it was the most counterproductive exercise in presidential speech making in American history. It did nothing. As a matter of fact, Andrewjohnson got chased out of a few towns. While beating the drum for his narrow view of Reconstruction in 1866, Johnson went on that speaking tour. It was scheduled for 18 days, and things started to go sour halfway through when Cleveland, Ohio crowds greeted Johnson with boos. In Bloomington, Johnson was practically drowned out with a chorus of jeers. The audience surrounding his train begging instead for an appearance by Ulysses S. Grant. Pulling away, Johnson saw an effigy hanging from a pole near the train tracks holding both bread and butter, a nod to the disparaging bread and butter brigade term for his appointees. So yeah, bottom line is, this little whistle-stop tour was not taken in good context. It was a disaster. It was foolish. Johnson looked foolish. And the result was that the Republicans won the congressional elections of 1866 overwhelmingly. Overwhelmingly, they won. So now you have a combination of radical Republicans and moderate Republicans, and they hold a 2/3 majority in Congress. So now that any veto that Johnson might have applied to their measures, they could overturn because they had enough power. So Johnson was really screwed. So now a tug of war between the two branches ensues. Congress passes a Reconstruction Act that reverses much of what Andrewjohnson had done. And then Congress comes up with the Tenure of Office Act. And what that does is it does not allow Johnson to fire one of his cabinet members without the Senate reviewing it. Well, Andrewjohnson, he wanted quite naturally to be able to fire the people who worked for him. And Congress said, no, you can't. So Johnson, aggravated, mad, ticked off, whatever, adage you want to use here, Johnson was not going to give up any of his executive authority. And defying Congress, he fired Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, who was a Republican and who was a Lincoln holdover. Well, Congress now immediately sees this as the first step to use military force to take over the War Department so that you can control the Army, and you could use the Army and the War Department for goodness knows what kind of purposes. That's the way Congress viewed that firing. And, now you start to realize that it's not terribly surprising that Andrewjohnson would become the first president ever to be impeached, because the level of distrust and hatred was extreme during his presidency. It just was. And now we are up to the timeline of, on February 24th of 1868, Congress, for the first time, impeached a sitting president on 11 counts of high crimes and misdemeanors. Johnson's fate would be decided by a trial in the Senate 3.5 months later. So here we go. We have our first impeached president, Andrewjohnson, first president to ever be impeached. And the truth of the matter is, when the trial was going to Senate, no one knows for sure how the vote is going to go. It is very narrow. A few senators. There's a feeling that they may go one way or they may go another. It's just truly unclear. It would take a 2/3 vote in the Senate to convict him. And at the time, 2/3 of a vote meant 36 votes. And there were 45 Republicans in the Senate. So they had more than enough Republicans to get this done. Well, trial happens, and the vote happens, and the vote was 35 votes to convict and 19 votes to acquit. Andrewjohnson got off by 1 vote. And the sentiment really was that the Senate thought that it would probably permanently weaken the presidency, and that it would tip the balance too far in the direction of Congress. So that is why they voted to not convict Andrew Johnson. And, the bottom line is that Andrew Johnson's victory, however, it was a very hollow one. He had no power, and he had damaged the office of president. And Congress really proved that they had the power overall. That's just what it came down to. So, Andrew Johnson, first president ever impeached. Not surprisingly, the Democrats did not nominate him for re-election in 1868. He was not renominated for re-election. And, he goes down as one of the probably worst, if not the worst president in our history. And, a lot of people say he may have been, if not one of the most racist presidents we've ever had. There's a lot of allegations and stories regarding just bad bigotry and racist things as far as Johnson goes. He was just a disaster. When you go from Abraham Lincoln, who, let's face facts, may be our greatest president of all time, to Andrew Johnson, it's like night and day. So now we're going to get into his gravesite. I'm going to read a little blurbs for you. After his presidency ended in 1869, Andrew Johnson returned home to Greenville, Tennessee. He later chose to re-enter public service and was elected to the Senate in 1875, representing his home state of Tennessee, and he became the only former president to serve as a senator after leaving the White House. 2 years prior to his senatorial election in 1873, a severe case of cholera permanently damaged his lower limbs. He never fully regained use of his legs from the knees down, often stumbling when he walked in. In the summer of 1875, Andrew Johnson began to suffer from exhaustion. In Greenville, he met with Dr. Marion Maloney and confided in him that he was completely worn out and did not think he could hold out more than a year or two longer. And then on Monday, July 26th of 1875, Andrew Johnson met with his family physician, who also expressed concern with the former president's health. Johnson planned to visit his daughter, Mary Brown, at her farm 45 miles away in Elizabethtown to recuperate. That's where he was going to go. And for the previous 6 weeks, his wife Eliza had been staying there, and Johnson was looking forward to reuniting with her. His son Andrew pleaded that he was in too delicate of a state of health to attempt the journey, but Johnson was insistent. On Wednesday, July 28th of 1875, Andrew Johnson boarded a 5:57 a.m. train to Elizabethtown. He arrived at Carter Station in good spirits and was greeted by one of his daughter's servants, who took him by carriage to Mary's house. It was a hot day, and after seven jostling miles, he arrived exhausted. After a hearty dinner, he walked upstairs to rest in the bedroom. Andrew Johnson gazed out the window at the grazing cattle as he talked with his granddaughter Lily, when suddenly he fell from his chair. He had suffered a stroke and could not speak or move the right side of his body. His family rushed to help, lifting him off the floor and placing him on the bed. They wanted to call a doctor, but Andrew Johnson waved them off, refusing medical assistance. He was confident he would recover. He slowly regained his speech, and the next day partial movement on his right side was restored. But by Thursday, July 29th of 1875, he conceded to call Dr. Abraham Job, a good friend and physician who lived 2 miles away. Job arrived at 5 p.m. along with Dr. Cameron, and by the next day, although still in great pain, Andrew Johnson was able to talk with his physicians and family about such subjects as, of course, politics. However, Job knew Andrew Johnson's condition was perilous and summoned his son Andrew and daughter, Martha Peterson, to the home. They arrived from Greenville Friday night, along with Dr. Taylor and another physician, Dr. James F. Broyles. And however, Johnson had suffered a second stroke and was again unable to speak. At 7 p.m. that night, he slipped into a coma. Andrew Johnson, the 17th President of the United States, died at 2:30 a.m. on Saturday, July 31st of 1875. With him were Dr. Taylor, Dr. Broyles, his wife, and 3 children, Andrew, Martha, and Mary's 2 daughters and son. The only family members not present were his grandchildren, Andrew and Mary Bell. And that was it. Andrew Johnson was dead. There was obviously a viewing, and, a funeral that took place. And basically, it was time. I'm actually going to show you right here on the screen pictures of the house where Johnson died. You'll see a picture from the 1930s and then a more recent picture as it looked today. It's in its new location on Brooks Farm. I did not visit this. So just so everybody knows, I did not visit the actual house where he died in. But these are pictures of that you're seeing on the screen. There was a viewing. There was a viewing at the Johnson Homestead, which is right on Main Street in Greenville, Tennessee. And the burial location was originally purchased in 1852 by Andrew Johnson, who liked to climb the 100-foot hill to relax on the summit, and he planted a willow tree to mark the spot where he wanted to be buried. During the Civil War, this hill was known as Signal Hill because soldiers climbed its heights to alert their comrades, but after the monument was built, it became known as Monument Hill. The cemetery remained under ownership of the family for the next 4 decades after Johnson's death, and then in 1906 it was transferred to the War Department, and it was transformed into a national cemetery. And this is the pictures here on the screen now of Andrew Johnson's gravesite. It's at the Andrew Johnson National Cemetery, right there in Greenville, Tennessee. And I have to be honest with you guys, for being one of the worst presidents we've ever had, for being the first president to ever be impeached in our country's history, and for all of his downfalls and shortcomings, Andrew Johnson's gravesite and tomb here that you're seeing on the screen was one of the nicest that I had ever seen as far as a presidential gravesite. No, it's not in my top 5, but it is a very, very pretty location. As I said, it's up on a hill. It overlooks mountains. I think it's probably the Smoky Mountain Range off in the distance you can see. You're seeing probably some from some of the pictures on the screen. It's just beautiful. I mean, it really is. It's quiet. It's quaint. It's picturesque. Anything you want to use to describe it, it's that. It's just very beautiful. And I did enjoy it. I really did. I actually sat, there's a bench right near his gravesite, and I sat on the bench for about 10 minutes and just looked out, at the mountain range. It was early in the morning when I went, like 8 or 9 in the morning. So it was just beautiful. It was absolutely beautiful. So, again, for all the downfalls and shortcomings of Andrew Johnson, his final place of rest is quite a beautiful one. So that's it. That's the gravesite of Andrew Johnson, our 17th president of the United States. So we saw his birthplace in North Carolina. We saw a couple other pictures, his tailor shop, his homestead in Greenville, Tennessee. Those are places I didn't visit, but I showed you photos I found online, of course, of those. And there you go. That is a look at the life and legacy and presidency and death of the 17th president of the United States, the very first president to ever be impeached, Andrew Johnson of Tennessee. I hope you enjoyed this presidential series installment. Next week, of course, we will be taking a look at the 18th president of the United States, Ulysses S. Grant, which I'm looking forward to because he's one of my favorite guys. So be interesting and fun to look into him. So stay tuned for that. Hope you guys are enjoying all this. Thank you so much for all the subscriptions, comments, likes, questions, all that stuff. Love it. Please keep them coming. Leave your comments and questions below. Love answering the questions. People always ask me, hey, TJ, what do you think of this? Love it. Keep asking. But thanks so much for the support, guys. We will see you next week. Thanks so much. Bye-bye now.